Hey, Aaron Rabinowitz here for Red Giant TV. And in this episode of Red Giant TV, inspired by the logo for the Hunger Games Catching Fire, Michael Park returns to us with an awesome tutorial on creating procedural fire. That is, fire that is entirely software-based, and he'll be using Trapcode Particular to do it. Light it up, Mike.
Hey everybody, Michael Park here. A little while back, I was inside of After Effects playing with Particular and came up with this cool stylized fire effect. It uses 4 separate layers of particular, each almost identical to the other, with a few minor tweaks so that we get some different looks so that when they're all blended together, they look like a fire. This effect is built up with an emitter object, a smoke layer, some thick body sparks, some thick flames on top of that, some additional sparks flying off the end, and then some additional layers for some glow and shine to get the final effect. Let's go ahead and get started. Here we are inside of After Effects, and we first need to start with a new composition. So let's choose Composition, New Composition, and we'll make this a 720p preset, and we'll change the frame rate to 24 frames per second. Call this Final Comp, and the duration of 10 seconds will work fine. Let's click OK. Now the first thing we need to do to this composition is to change the bit depth. By default, After Effects starts in 8 bits per channel, but we need this to be in 32 bits per channel because we're going to be using some high dynamic range colors. So you can either simply Alt-click this bits per channel here and cycle through, or you can click it and choose your depth manually like so. Next we need to add a new layer to this by choosing Layer, New, Solid, and we'll call this BG for background. Next we're going to create a pre-composition which will be the source for our fire. We're going to use a black and white image to drive the particles emitting from our emitter object. So let's create a new composition by choosing Composition, New Composition, and we'll call this Emitter Source. And make sure it's the same size as our final comp, 10 seconds long, and click OK. To this we need to add a black and white layer which will represent the source for our particles. So whatever is going to be white in here will emit particles. Whatever is black will not emit particles. I've gone ahead and created a masked out layer here, which I'm going to be using. As you can see, it's the biohazard symbol, and this is created by using a new solid layer with a bunch of masks, but you can use whatever layer or whatever logo you want as long as it's black and white. The reason why I chose to create this using masks is for my emitter object, at least the visual part of it, I'm going to be using Element 3D from Video Copilot, and I can simply extrude whatever the masks are that I have and get a very nice 3D shape. You can do this effect with just a 2D layer and a texture, or you can use any of the various 3D capabilities of After Effects. For example, if you have the new After Effects CC, you can use Cinema 4D Lite, or you can use Photoshop 3D, or any number of different ways to create the emitter object visually for your scene. But for the pre-composition, all you need is a 2D representation of what the surface of your emitter object will look like. I'm simply going to take my solid here and Control X to cut it out and paste it into my emitter source. And I'm also going to take this white solid, I'm going to rename this emitter, and hit Control C to copy it from this and come into the final composition and paste it. We're going to need, at least for my purposes, the masked layer inside of our final comp so that we can create a custom layer for Element 3D. We also need this in the emitter source layer so that we can have it catch fire. Next thing I'm going to do is select just what I want to emit the particles. In this case, I have the ring on the outside where I want the particles to be emitted from. In this composition, whatever is white will be going up in flames. So let's get rid of the middle section here. I'm just going to hit M to reveal the masks, and basically anything below the 2 red masks I can simply delete by selecting them and deleting them out, so I just have the ring which I want to emit the particles from. Now if I left it solid white like this, it would emit particles from all over the body uniformly. In my opinion, fire doesn't look very uniform. It's very organic and moves around a lot. So I want the fire to be emitted from various patches on this object, not from the entire object altogether. We're going to accomplish this by adding some turbulent noise to our emitter object. Now since I have this masked out, I can simply apply the noise layer directly to this. If you have just a 2D black and white image, you may need to create a new solid noise layer and then use one of the various track mats to select only the white part as your opaque section for the noise layer. In my case, let's just grab the emitter layer and choose Effect, Noise and Grain, Turbulent Noise. I want this to be pretty patchy, and right now it's relatively uniform. So let's change the type of noise or type of fractal from basic to rocky, and that breaks it up a little bit. But it's still too much white and gray. I want it to be more black and white. So let's increase the contrast until we're happy with it. I'd say about 250 looks good. As I said previously, I want this to be a little more organic and move, so what we can do is keyframe the evolution or change the evolution over time so that it moves around the emitter object. Now you can either do this by just left clicking and creating two keyframes, or you can create a little expression by alt left clicking the stopwatch and typing time times 50. If we scrub through the timeline, you can see that our turbulent noise evolves over time and we don't need keyframes in this at all. Let's hop back in our final composition and let's grab our emitter source and drop that into our final composition. As you can see, it lines up with our prior emitter layer. Let's make this a 3D layer, and now let's create our 3D object. Like I said, I'll be using element, so this may apply to you if you want to use element. If you don't and you just want your emitter layer to be visible, you can do something like add a texture to it or something like that to make it look more interesting. Let's create a new layer by choosing Layer, New Solid, and we'll call this Element. To this, let's add Effect, Video Copilot, Element, and what we need to do is to come down to our Custom Layers, Custom Text and Masks, and choose our emitter as our custom layer. Let's hop into the scene setup and make this a little bit smaller. We can simply extrude our layer, and we see we got a perfect representation of our emitter object. Make a couple quick tweaks here. I'm going to decrease the extrusion. I want this to be a little flatter, maybe 0.25. That looks better. And I'm just going to throw a texture on here. Element comes with some textures, and you can also get some pro shaders. I'm just going to grab a metal pro shader, do something that looks a little more like gold/brass. I think that'll look great. And let's click OK. Next, you can see our emitter object for element is a lot bigger than our underlying layer. We need to match these up. So let's go into the group settings, or group 1, to the particle look, and we'll decrease the particle size until it lines up perfectly. And in this case, it looks like about 4 makes it line up absolutely perfectly. The key here is to have our emitter source and our element layer line up. That way it will look like the particles will be emitted from our 3D emitter, since the emitter layer lines up perfectly in 3D space. We can double check this by adding a camera by choosing Layer, New, Camera. Give it a 50mm preset and click OK. We'll grab the Unified Camera tool and spin it around, and it looks like our emitter layer lines up perfectly with our element 3D layer, which looks great. Now we can hide the emitter source and the emitter layer and just leave our 3D element layer. Now it's time to start building the fire. So for that we need a new solid in particular. So let's choose Layer, New Solid, and we'll call this Particular Main Sparks. Make sure it's comp size, and let's click OK. To this, let's add Effect, Trapcode Particular. The first thing we ought to do is scrub down the timeline a little bit so we have some particles actually on the screen. About 2 seconds should work well. We also need to tell Particular we want the particles to emit from our emitter layer, not just from a point in space. So let's come up here to the emitter settings and change this emitter type from point to layer. Then we'll come down to the layer emitter and we'll choose our emitter source pre-comp. So we'll twirl this down and choose emitter source. Now if we scrub through the timeline, you can see there's particles being emitted only from the area with our symbol on. If you look closely at our composition, you can see we actually have some black particles being emitted. And that's because our emitter source object is both black and white right now, and we only want the white to emit particles. What we need to do is come back to our emitter source and make one final adjustment. We need to add another new layer by choosing Layer, New, Solid, and this time we'll make this pure white. Let's click OK. And what we want to do is have this white take the luminance of our ring for its alpha. We can do that by changing the track matte from none to luma matte of the emitter. Now if we toggle the transparency, you can see all we have is white on the layer where the white was, and it is transparent on the layer where the black was. We come back to the final composition, you can see that we have eliminated all the black particles, and the particles are only being emitted from the white on our layer. We can see this even better if we turn the velocity down to 0 and the velocity random down to 0 and scrub through the timeline and see the particles being emitted. We need to increase the particle count a little bit, so let's increase the particles per second from 100 to 300,000. We're going to be using a lot of particles in this composition. Now if we scrub through the timeline, you can see the particles are being emitted only from those sections where we have the white on our emitter source and not from where the black was. However, we don't want the particles to stay on our emitter object very long, so let's decrease the particle life. We can do that by twirling down the particle settings and changing the life from 3 down to 0.1. We actually aren't going to be using the main particles for any type of visibility whatsoever. All we're going to do is emit the particles for 0.1 second and use the auxiliary particles to drive the rest of our effects. However, since we're going to need to see the effect of some of the physics on the particles before we turn on the auxiliary particles, we'll leave these visible for now. I also want these main particles to kick off the surface of our emitter source a little bit, so let's come back up and turn the velocity back up to the default of 100 and the velocity random back up to 20. Let's twirl down to the physics settings and make some changes. Under physics and under the air section, let's change some of the turbulence settings so that we have the turbulence affecting our particles. Let's increase the effect position from 0 to 10. This will push the particles in a little more of an organic manner. We also want to introduce some wind in order to drive the flame effects. Now for this, we want the wind to push the particles to the right, up, and towards the camera. In order to do this, we need to push the particles in the positive X direction, so we can scrub the wind X until we're happy with it. I think somewhere about 250 should be good. We also need to push the particles up in the Y direction, and up in Y is negative in this case, so we'll go down to negative 125, and Z towards the camera is negative as well, so we'll push this down to about negative 200. The particles are moving, but we need to decrease the amount of time that our turbulence fades in. The particles aren't going to be on screen very long, and we want the turbulence to affect it almost immediately. By default, the fade-in time for the turbulence is set to 0.5 seconds. Let's decrease that to 0.2. Now that we have our turbulence set up, we can turn on our auxiliary particles. So let's come down to the auxiliary system and turn the emitter from off to continuously. Now right away you can see a whole lot more particles. Let's go ahead and turn off the main particles so that we don't have to see those. We can do that by changing the size from 5 down to 0. Now all we have emitting are the auxiliary particles. Let's turn the life down a little bit so that they're not seen for quite as long on screen, from 0.5 to 0.3. And let's also change some of the physics settings so that we can see what these particles are actually doing. Down here under the physics settings, let's increase the wind effect position to 100. Now you can see the particles are being pushed off the surface of our emitter to the right, up, and towards the camera, which is exactly what we want. However, the turbulence isn't affecting them yet. We can change that by increasing the turbulent position from 0 to 200. Now we've got a little bit more of the organic flow that we're looking for. We scrub through the timeline. You can see it looks a lot better already. I think we need to decrease the particle size and increase the number of particles, so let's do that. Let's change the size from 5 all the way down to 1, and let's increase the opacity from the default 50 up to 100 so we see the particles a little bit better. I still think we need some more particles, so let's increase the particles per second from 10 up to 50. That looks a lot better. However, I don't know about you, but I don't think I've ever seen rainbow colored fire. So let's go ahead and change that next. We can twirl down the color over life, and from this dialog box we can change our colors. Let's just grab the white to black default at first, and we can double click the white patch here to bring up a dialog box, and we're going to use a high dynamic range color, or color above the value of 111 in the RGB. For this, let's go up to 2, 1.5, and 1. If we toggle the hue here, you can see that it's kind of this bright orange color. And this is the color that it will be if you add any type of motion blur or glow to it. This is the color which will bleed through, which is a nice fiery orange color. And that's great. Click OK, and then we can double click the black patch here and change the red, green, blue value to 1, 0.23, and 0. This gives us a really bright fiery orange. We'll click OK. Let's change a couple more settings and then move on to our next layer. We want to change the transfer mode from normal to add to brighten up the particles a little bit where they overlap. I also want to increase the randomness of the life to 100, the size to 100, and the opacity to 70. This will just randomize the particles a little bit more and give it more of an organic feel. The last thing I want to do is add just a little bit of motion blur in. Now there's two ways to do this with Particular. You can either turn on the master motion blur for the layer and for the composition itself by toggling the motion blur swatch here, and you can see we've introduced some motion blur to our particles. But if we want to have an individual motion blur setting for each of our particle layers, which we do, we don't want to use this because all the layers will use the same settings. Fortunately, Particular has its own motion blur built in if you just turn it on. By default, it's set to the comp settings, but you can change that to on. And from this, you can dial in your own shutter angle, which is how much of a blur is applied. By default, it's set to 360, but I'm going to dial that back to 60. I want some motion blur on the fastest moving particles, but I still want to keep the individual particle look for the vast majority of our particles. This layer needs to be more of a spark layer as opposed to a thick blurred out flame tendrily look. That's what our next layer is going to look like. Speaking of our next layer, let's go ahead and create a duplicate of this main spark layer by hitting Control D with the layer selected. We'll click Enter and rename this Particular Thick Flames. Alright, now it took a while to set up the prior layer, but this layer will go a whole lot faster because we're going to utilize really the exact same settings as the previous layer, but make a few minor tweaks. Everything up top stays the same, but let's come down here to the physics setting. Now we want this to be a little more random than having the particles completely overlap. There's a couple different ways we can do this. We can change some of the turbulent settings or things like that, or we can simply dial the physics time factor down from 1 to 0.8. What we've effectively done was remap the timing of all of our settings here all at once. And that way we're going to get a different look for our flames and a different look and position for all of our particles. Let's come down here to the air section of the physics, to the turbulence field, and we're going to increase the move with wind from 80 to 150. What this will do is force the particles to move a little more violently with the wind and create a little more motion in this layer. Coming down to the auxiliary system settings, I want to change the opacity over life. And right now it's set to being full on the entire time. Let's solo the layer so we can see what we're doing a little bit better. And I want this to just kind of die out at the end here. So I'm going to draw this little curve, which will force the particles to die or fade out. And we can smooth that out by clicking the smooth button. I also want to change the color and decrease the brightness of this a little bit. The way I'm going to do that is affecting the end color here. I want it bright at the beginning, but a lot dimmer as we get through the life of the particle. So let's bring this down to more of a rusty color. We'll go with a red value of about 0.5. We'll decrease the green value to half of what it is to 0.12 and leave blue at 0, which gives us this dark kind of rusty color. I'm now going to move this color swatch from the very end about 2/3 of the way towards the front so that the particles get a lot darker a lot faster. I'm going to decrease the particles even further by changing the transfer mode from add to screen. I want these particles to create tendrils which go a little further out than the main particle sparks, so I'm going to increase the life just a little bit from 0.3 to 0.4. That way they'll extend out a little bit further. We have a few too many particles on screen here for this effect. Like I said, I want this to be a lot duller. So what I'm going to do is decrease the emit probability from 100 down to 50. Now this means that instead of every single main particle emitting particles, only half the particles, the main particles, will emit auxiliary particles. This is different than simply cutting the particles per second down, because the particle per second has to do with how many particles are being emitted from each main particle, while as the emit probability has to do with whether or not the main particles emit any auxiliary particles whatsoever. That being said, I'm still going to decrease the particles per second from 50 down to 10. However, I want this to be a little thicker body, and I want all these particles to blend together, so I'm going to increase the size from 1 up to 3 to bring back some of the thickness to our particles. And I also want to increase the feathering from 30 to 100%, which will make these meld together just a little bit more. Speaking of melding together, let's change the motion blur settings a little bit. Since our prior layer had the motion blur set to on and a shutter angle of 60, we need to change this to increase the motion blur. Now I'm going to choose a very high motion blur so that we get a very blurred out particles, and this will help to create more of a tendrily look as opposed to kind of a very spark look. So we're going to change the shutter angle from 60 to 180. However, it's very linear looking, and that's because the type of motion blur we have by default is set to linear. This effectively takes one frame, say frame 13 and frame 14, and looks at where each individual particle is on frame 13, where it moves to on 14, and creates a motion blur between those two particles. However, in particular, we have another type of motion blur sampling, which is called subframe sample. And what this will do is take a look at each individual subframe between the two frames. Say 13 to frame 14 would be divided 8 times, which is the number of levels, and actually track where that particle is during the middle of those frames. However, since we have the levels only set to 8, it's a little bit choppy. We can smooth that blur out a bit by increasing the levels. Now this is a trade-off between accuracy and speed. Linear is a lot faster, but in this case we want the accurate look of this, so we'll increase this to 24, and it is a much smoother approximation of where those particles would be. Alright, now we've blurred the particles out, but it still is not looking very flame-like. Let's add a couple more effects to help this out. To this layer, let's add Effect, Blur and Sharpen, CC Vector Blur. What we're going to do is increase the amount of blur until we're happy with it. In this case, we'll bring it up to about 15. And as you can see, it really blends the layers together a little bit better. We're also going to decrease the ridge smoothness from 1 to 0.5 just to make the ends a little bit less harsh. However, it's still looking a little bit rough through the sections, so to this I'm going to add Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and this time we're going to add a Fast Blur. We're going to blur this out until it's not quite as sharp. I think level 4 looks pretty good for this purpose. I can see that the wind is pushing our particles maybe a little bit too much, and it's causing some interesting looking colors here that I'm not real happy with. So what I'm going to do is come back up to the particular layer, and let's decrease the wind effect percentage of the auxiliary particles from 100 down to 40. This will bring our particles a little bit closer and not spread them out quite so much. I think I want to introduce just a little bit more, so we'll maybe increase that from 40 up to 60. This is just something you need to play with your individual composition till you get a look that you like. Alright, let's duplicate this layer by selecting it and hitting Ctrl D. And this time we're going to rename this Particular Sparks. Let's go ahead and solo this individual layer, and we can delete the blurs we just applied. And come back here to the motion blur, and we can turn the subframe sample off and the shutter angle down to 30. Next thing we need to do is decrease the amount of particles pretty significantly. So we'll come up here to the emit probability and decrease this down to 10. However, I'm going to increase the particles per second up to 15. These sparks are a little bit big, so we're going to change the size from 3 all the way down to 1.5. So basically cut it in half. Now we've got these small sparks. However, sparks seem to fly off a little bit faster than everything else. Let's come up here under the physics turbulent settings and increase the move with wind from 150 up to 180. This will make the particles react a little bit stronger to the wind, and we can come down here to the physics setting under the auxiliary system and turn the wind effect percentage up to 300 and also the turbulent position up to 300. And right away you can see the sparks are getting much further away from our main ring, which is exactly what we want. Let's also change the color a bit. We know that the final smoke layer we're going to have is going to be more of a purplish hue. So I want these sparks to kind of fade out to that color to blend in a little bit better. So let's come up here to the color over life, and we can leave the initial color the same, but let's turn the middle color here up to kind of a nice peachy color, maybe a little bit more red. And then we'll add a color down here, and we'll give it kind of a nice mid-purple color, maybe a hint more blue. And these will just fade out over time. You can see right here you're getting a little bit of that purple. All right, let's unsole the layer and see what we have. Not too bad so far. We can change the transfer mode of the sparks from normal to screen, the thick flames from normal to screen, and then the main sparks from normal to screen as well. So we've got kind of our spark layers here coming off, and they're nice and random and turbulent, but we don't have any of our smoke layer, and that's the next thing we need to put in here. However, I want to create a custom composition for our smoke layer just to give it some more definition than a thick particle. So let's do that by choosing Composition, New Composition, and we'll call this Smoke Source. And let's create a small composition, something like 200 by 200, 10 seconds, and click OK. Now to this, let's add a new layer by choosing Layer, New Solid. It doesn't really matter what color it is, we'll just call this Smoke Particle, and click OK. Let's take the pen tool and just kind of rough round shape. It doesn't have to be perfect. In fact, I don't want it to be perfect. And to this, we're going to add a roughen edges effect to break this up a little bit. So let's come up here to Effect and choose Stylize Roughen Edges. And let's increase the border up until 100 or so. The edges here are a little too broken up. We want these to be kind of big rough edges, not these really small ones. So let's increase the scale until we're happy. And I think about 550 or 560 looks good. I also want to create the illusion of upward movement of our particle. And the way we're going to do that is by offsetting the turbulence. Like I said, y direction or negative in the y direction is up. So if we twirl the offset turbulence in the y parameter here negatively, you can see it looks like the smoke is rising. Now we can, I said before, we can simply set a keyframe, or we can type a little expression in. And I think I'm going to use the expression, so we'll Alt left click the stopwatch, and this time we'll use an open bracket, and we want no effect or zero effect in the x direction, comma, and then we'll write a quick expression, time times negative 100 in the y direction, close the bracket, hit enter on your number pad, and if we scrub through the timeline, you can see we have the look what we're after, which is the look of the smoke kind of going up as we scrub through the timeline. This looks pretty good, but we need to roughen it up a little bit more. So to this, let's add Effect, Noise and Grain, Turbulent Noise. Now this is a little bit too muted to add too much texture to it. So let's increase the contrast up until we're happy. About 250 looks good. And like we did with our other composition, we only want the white to show through. So let's go ahead and take this and choose Layer, New, Solid. Click OK. I'm going to drop this below the smoke particle, grab the white solid and change the track matte from none to luma matte of the smoke particle. And if we toggle the transparency, you can see all we have is the white showing through. One thing I'm noticing is the edges are a little bit still too harsh on this. I want these to be a nice soft edge so that they'll blend nicely with all the particles. So I'm going to go back up to the smoke particle, and right after the roughen edges effect, I'm going to choose Effect, Blur and Sharpen, Fast Blur. Pull it up above the turbulent noise. And I'm going to do this just to blur out the edges a little bit. I think a setting of about 25 should do nicely. Let's hop back over to our final composition, and we're going to take our smoke source composition, pre-comp, and drop it in below the background, turn its visibility off. Let's come up to our particular sparks layer and hit Control D to duplicate that. I'm going to rename this Particular Smoke, and let's solo this layer and come to the settings here, and we're going to decrease the particles per second from 300,000 down to 10,000. We also don't need the smoke moving quite as fast as the sparks, so we can come down here to the physics settings and change the move with wind from 180 back down to 150. Let's go back down to the auxiliary system here and we're going to increase the particles per second from 15 to 60 to make our smoke a little denser, and increase the emit probability up to 20. Next, let's make the particles stay on a little bit longer, so let's increase the life from 0.4 to 1.2. We can also increase the size from 1.5 all the way up to 100. Now we have this big blob of color, and we haven't used our custom sprite particle or our custom texture yet as a sprite particle. The way we do that is we come up to the main particles, which are still invisible, but we need to change the particle type from sphere to sprite colorize. Now we don't see anything because we haven't chosen a texture yet. Come down here to the texture dialog box, and for layer we'll pick our smoke source, and for time sampling we're going to choose random loop. This way we'll get that nice animation that we worked so hard to create. Now that we have our particle set up, let's come back here to the auxiliary settings and change a few more things. For color over life, we want this to be a nice dark purple. So let's reset our color and open up our initial color swatch by double clicking it, and come down here and choose a nice kind of dark purpley color, maybe a little more red in the smoke to begin with, and then we'll grab a little more of a darker purple for the end, a little bluer as if it's cooling off a little bit. And right now the smoke is way too opaque. We'll decrease the opacity down to 15. Now you can see we have a nice kind of pillowy smoke look, but I still think it's a little bit too much. So we can change that with some opacity over life, and we'll come down here a little ways. We want it to be not visible for the first part of its life, so it gets a little bit beyond the ring and doesn't start emitting till the end of our flames. And then we'll draw a little curve and have it die out, and we'll smooth that out a little bit. We can always come back and adjust this curve a little bit later if we're not happy with the look. We don't need a whole lot of the smoke, just enough to give it the look and give a little more color in the shadows here. Let's further change some settings by dialing back the wind effect percentage. This doesn't need to move quite as fast as the sparks, so we'll dial this back to 75, and the turbulent position we can bring back to 200. Now you see the smoke staying on a lot longer, and the opacity maybe we want to drop down to 10, and you basically just play with these settings until you're happy with the look that you get. You can also change the emit probability maybe down to 10, so you have more of a kind of broken up smoke effect, and particles per second down to 40. Like I said, it's a balancing act until you get the look you're after. Just keep messing around with the settings until you're happy. Alright, that's it for the smoke, and we can unsolo that. As you can see, it really does add a lot of color and visual interest to our fire. Let's drop this underneath the main sparks, and we need to really punch up the colors a little bit. So let's do that by adding a layer, new adjustment layer, and we'll call this glow. We'll bring this above all the rest of the layers, and to this let's add effect, stylize, glow. And we're going to decrease the glow threshold so more stuff glows from 60 down to 25. We're going to increase the glow radius so it's a little more of a diffuse glow up to perhaps 40, and let's decrease the glow intensity down to 0.2 so it's not glowing quite as much. I also want to control the color of the glow a little bit. I want this to be a more fiery look, so instead of our original colors I'm going to choose A and B colors, and for color A I'm going to choose kind of a light orangish yellow, and for color B I'll choose a little more of a orangish bright orange color, maybe a hint more red. Okay, and this is looking good, but I think we need a little bit brighter glow and a more diffuse glow, so let's duplicate the glow by hitting Control D, and this time we'll decrease the glow threshold down to 20 and increase the glow radius to something a lot higher, maybe 350 or so. You can either leave it at the A and B colors we put before, or we can go back to the original colors. And if you do that, we need to decrease the glow intensity, so maybe 0.1 will make it look a lot better, and maybe we can increase the threshold just a little bit and tweak these settings in until you're happy with the look. Alright, we're almost there. I think we could punch this up just a little bit more, I want to create some rays of glow coming off this thing. And the way we're going to do that is by having another adjustment layer by choosing Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And this one we'll call Shine. And to this, let's add Effect, Trapcode, Shine. And by default, you get this really interesting look, and quite frankly, it's kind of cool, but not exactly what we're after. Let's take the source point and drag it down here to the bottom left-hand corner. So going to match the kind of the wind direction that we're using. And let's decrease the ray length down from 4 to about 0.4. So it's a lot smaller. I also want to change the colorize color a little bit, so we'll twirl that down. And the highlights are set to white. I want to dim those down to kind of a bright yellow, so it's not as hot of a hot spot. And select OK. The transfer mode I'm going to change from none to screen. So it goes over top our effect, but it really blows it out. So let's decrease the shine opacity until we're happy with the look. Maybe down to about 35% or so. And voila, I think we have a really cool looking fire effect. But since I talked about earlier this thing catching fire, I think it'd be kind of cool to animate the particles coming on over time, not just emitting from the surface all at once. So we can control that by coming back to our emitter source. And really it's as simple as creating a mask and animating it, or you can do something even simpler like choosing the emitter layer here and choosing Effect, Transition, Linear Wipe. We're going to change the wipe angle to -90 so that it wipes on from the left to the right. We can increase the transition completion up to 100, set a keyframe, maybe have it animate on over a second, and we'll change the transition completion back down to 0, increase the feathering amount a little bit so it's not quite as harsh of a line, even though honestly it's not going to matter too much since this is emitting particles, but still nice to include every little bit to just refine your composition that much more. And if we come back to the final comp, you can see that now if we let the timeline play a little bit, you have the fire kind of catching and moving around your emitter as opposed to just coming on all at once. And I think this adds a whole lot of visual interest and dimension to our project. Finally, let's set up just a quick camera move by grabbing a new null layer, Layer New Null Object, make it a 3D layer, and I'm going to parent our camera to it. Grab the camera and bring it up below just so it's easier to find. Parent our camera, grab the null object, hit R to reveal the rotation, and let's solo our element layer so that we can see what we're doing. And we're going to rotate this in the negative X direction, maybe starting at 45 degrees or so. Set a keyframe, and we can rotate this through to 0 degrees. Select those two keyframes and easy ease them by hitting F9 or choosing Keyframe Assistant Easy Ease. So now we've got this nice animation of our emitter object slowly rotating up. And when we unsolo everything, we'll have the fire effect in full 3D and our emitter rotating. Actually, our camera's rotating over top of it. So we get one more dimension of 3D movement just to make our composition look that much more interesting. So there you have it, a cool, customizable, fully 3D fire effect using only Trapcode Particular, Trapcode Shine, and Adobe After Effects. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and learned a couple new tricks or techniques. As always, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks, Mike. I have really missed your tutorials. Previously, Michael has delivered some fantastic training on Trapcode Particular, such as creating a Christmas tree and a Harry Potter Death Eater apparition effect. Don't forget, you can download a free trial version of any of the Red Giant software that Mike used at redgiant.com, and you can get free presets for our plugins on redgiantpeople.com. Just in case, if you're interested in a more image-based fire effect, then check out Red Giant TV episode 89, called Tempo Up in Flames, where I talk about how we made fire for our short film Tempo. And speaking of short films, you can see all of our Red Giant films along with their behind-the-scenes videos at redgiant.com/films, which will take you directly to our new YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe. And to keep up with the latest news on new products, tutorials, tips, and deals, don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or on our blog. Once again, I'm Aaron Rabinowitz for Red Giant. See you soon.